Julian Assange is finally free after years of persecution for the crime of telling the truth. What did he expose? How was he treated? And what are some of the lessons that we need to reflect on, particularly as Muslims? Assange was the editor-in-chief of WikiLeaks, which released troves of documents exposing war crimes and corruption at the top of Western governments, particularly the US, that would make even the most corrupt dictators blush. In October 2010, for example, it released the Iraq war logs, troves of documents, videos, images evidencing war crimes and cover-ups, such as the infamous gunning down of Reuters journalists and unarmed civilians in the collateral murder video, killings of nearly 700 civilians that wandered too close to US air bases that were there illegally, by the way, as well as the deaths of 15,000 other civilians, routine torture of Iraqi captives, the abuse of 800 men and boys from the age of 14 years old and higher in Guantanamo. They exposed Hillary Clinton ordering US diplomats to spy on UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon and other diplomats from other countries, including the UK. This included obtaining their DNA, iris scans, fingerprints and passwords. They exposed the illegal overthrowing of democratically elected governments all over the world and replacing them with violently corrupt military regimes, not just all around the Muslim world where we're used to it, but in places like Honduras too. They exposed the presidentially authorized targeted assassinations of hundreds of people around the world, including US citizens themselves, secret bombing and drone programs, speeches Hillary Clinton made to companies like Goldman Sachs for which she was paid handsomely, her private assurances to corporate leaders that she'd do their bidding whilst promising the public financial regulation and reform. They exposed the hacking tools used by the US state permitted to spy on TVs, smartphones, laptops, antivirus software, allowing their rulers to record and store conversations, images and private text messages, even from encrypted apps. In summary, Julian Assange and the WikiLeaks team exposed the truth over and over again of the crimes of the US and its corrupt global ruling classes, and they tried to make an example out of him by punishing him in a childish, visceral reaction by the CIA, the unaccountable state within a state. A UN Special Rapporteur on Torture, Niels Melzer, wrote a damning report saying that Assange had undergone prolonged psychological torture during and after his judicial persecution by the US, UK, Ecuador and Sweden. He was holed up in an Ecuadorian embassy in London for 6 years, where he took refuge to escape being sent to Sweden because of Sweden's history of surrendering people to be tortured in CIA black sites. When a new Ecuadorian president came into power, he revoked his citizenship in 2019 without due process, and he was arrested by the UK authorities. After a 15-minute preparation with his lawyers and a 15-minute trial, which many people call a judicial farce, Assange was taken to Belmarsh prison to await extradition to the US. His lawyers complained that the husband of the judge that was convicting him was implicated in the WikiLeaks and said there was a clear conflict of interest, which is another embarrassment for the British state. All this is despite, as Meltzer argued, that Assange had hardly committed any crime himself. He accepted confidential information from whistleblowers who had themselves legal access to the things that they were sharing because they were whistleblowers doing the right thing. And now, after years of resisting extradition to the US, and importantly activism from people who are outraged by the grave injustices of arresting whistleblowers and exposers of crime instead of criminals themselves that they're exposing, he is finally en route back to his wife and children in Australia, if he doesn't mysteriously disappear on the way, after a face-saving plea bargain offered by Biden reportedly as a costless gesture to claw back young and angry voters. So how do we understand all of this? One of my favorite authors, Chris Hedges, who has been campaigning tirelessly for imprisoned journalists like Assange for a long time, explains masterfully why empire doesn't like being humiliated and exposed, even if the childish reactions like these do more to expose them.
Imperial powers do not forgive those who make public the sordid and immoral inner workings of empire. Empires are fragile constructions. Their power is as much one of perception as of military strength. The virtues they claim to uphold and defend, usually in the name of their superior civilization, are a mask for pillage, corruption, lies, the exploitation of cheap labor, indiscriminate violence against innocents, and state terror.
They perfected the tools they used against journalists at home by using them on what people like Frantz Fanon call the wretched of the earth, the racialized victim in the third world that have suffered the brunt of Western elites' insatiable appetite for destruction and exploitation. They then moved on to demonizing Muslims at home in the last few decades, for example, and many ignorant people just looked away, or worse yet, cheered them on as they slowly ebbed away at civil liberties, using the Muslim bogeyman to sell increasingly draconian policies and legislation that we have always warned would be used against more and more people. Things allegedly protecting the false idol of national security against so-called terrorism or espionage or subversion, now being used against people protesting against police militarization in the US, for example, or environmental and animal rights activists in the UK now. We told you so. But you looked the other way and turned your brains off while they were flouting basic rights and due process when it was going after demonized minorities. But that's the other lesson here. There have been brave, principled people who have been blowing whistles, exposing corruption and crimes and suffering the consequences at the same time as those looking away and not wanting to stick their heads above the parapet. It's not a Muslim or a non-Muslim thing. Sadly, many Muslims would be fine just looking the other way while oppression spreads. Many non-Muslims display more Islamic values of standing up for justice than them. Whistleblowers like Edward Snowden are still in exile. David McBride is still in a high security prison in Australia somewhere for blowing the whistle on the Australian massacre of Afghans, for example. People that carried out the crimes aren't in jail, but the people that exposed them are. And it's partly due to liberals who pay lip service to liberty and freedom but are too comfortable with their privilege to hold power to account where it really matters. Mainstream newspapers like The Guardian and The New York Times turned against the likes of Assange because, as his supporters say, he shamed them into doing their jobs, so they loathed him. They consider themselves part of the powerful elite. The award-winning journalists among them get pushed aside due to their opposition to illegal wars or corrupt power and end up reporting for alternative media outlets or just going solo on social media. People like Assange could have had a very comfortable life materially if they just sold out their principles of exposing injustice and just worked within these mainstream media and corporate frameworks. But they refused and paid the price, being attacked with all kinds of smears, and were thrown under the bus by many liberals and so-called progressives. And that's another lesson here for us. وَلِيَعْلَمَ الَّذِينَ نَافَقُوا, and that Allah may make evident those who are hypocrites. Western liberal hypocrisy has been laid bare. When it comes to demonizing minorities, the powerful and their liberal collaborators will be all je suis Charlie and we have to protect the privileged people's rights to mock, insult and lie about minorities. Check out the Levinson Inquiry, for example, and the resistance that it's seen. But they don't actually care about freedom of speech where it really matters. When it comes to exposing truth, and particularly inconvenient or embarrassing truths about powerful people. This is in stark contrast to the Sharia. Yes, the Sharia isn't liberal in that it doesn't give you the freedom to defame or lie about someone or wanton insult which has no intellectual benefit, but it commands that truth-telling be protected. Rulers are supposed to be held to account by the average person, not some divine right of kings or nation state today that's above the law or above reproach. Islam commands justice even if it's against your own self or kinsfolk. It makes spreading the truth a condition for salvation. وَالْعَصْرِ إِنَّ الْإِنسَانَ لَفِي خُسْرٍ إِلَّا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا وَعَمِلُوا الصَّالِحَاتِ وَتَوَاصَوْا بِالْحَقِّ وَتَوَاصَوْا بِالصَّبْرِ. But haters today focus on the prohibition of defamation and lying, for example, against the prophets or the symbols of Islam, and claim that they are pro-freedom for favouring cartoons over holding the powerful to account. A humble public service announcement to any so-called liberals that may be that way inclined. Put down the crayons and pick up a book. We have no problem with you articulating your disagreement to Islam and Muslims in a civilized way. We do have a problem with you caricaturing and defaming, particularly already demonized minorities. Anyway, back to Assange. Not only was the free speech hypocrisy unveiled, but the rule of law hypocrisy was also unveiled too. All the international bodies that bent over backwards at the behest of the US dark state to go after Assange flagrantly violated their own claimed rules about due process. The US has constitutional provisions in things like the First Amendment, so the elite there got their poodles like Tony Blair and his cronies to do their dirty work for them. That's when the historic extradition treaties were overturned in 2003 into a one-way system for when the US says jump, neocons here ask, how high? This evisceration of the rule of law wasn't just for Julian Assange but for everyone. Like other things, it was tested out on Muslim cartoon villains that the subservient media helped to create and spread to serve the unaccountable powerful. So the ignorant and foolish were looking away when people with long beards and literal hooks for hands were being extradited first to set the precedents for more and more abuses of power later. So what's our duty now? It should be, of course, a happy time for Julian Assange and his family, but at the same time we've got a lot more work to do to claw back some of the arbitrary powers given to unaccountable, unelected members of the so-called dark state. One thing that came to light in this whole saga was that the traditional commercial media only acted when they were shamed into doing their job. In other words, it's up to us, normal people, as well as alternative media platforms, to continue to make important news stories, narratives and witnesses too loud to ignore. Just like we've all been doing regarding the Gaza genocide. If it wasn't for us all carrying out this duty, the legacy media would have continued to be cheerleaders for genocide and ethnic cleansing like they have been for almost a century. Don't sit around and cry about how weak you are. Then you will be weak. Don't entertain any woe is me narratives the system is against us, global elites, military-industrial complex. Yeah, there are so-called systems against you, but sitting around whining about them isn't going to do anything. That's what the systems want you to do. The system is made out of people. People are motivated and animated by human desires and fears. Be a threat to them. Overthrow those people in any way you can, whether it's by using your voice, using your money, using your vote, using your consumer power, using your eyeballs on social media, for example. You can punish individuals that serve corrupt interests and reward and support individuals that support justice. Also, be realistic. You can't change the world overnight by yourself, but you can make a palpable difference to individuals in real life. Someone might argue, what's the point of all this activism for Julian Assange? It didn't change the system, but it changed one man's life and his family and friends. And it's these individual acts of courage and resistance that contribute to larger and larger changes. We shouldn't sit around and wait for some massive systemic structural changes to happen when we are able and capable of making some minor but really important changes. As the fuqaha say, al-maysur la yasqut bil-ma'sur. The possible isn't absolved by the impossible, meaning the presence of difficult or impossible challenges doesn't absolve your duty with regards to the achievable challenges that you have. That's because our duty is ultimately to Allah, and Allah doesn't hold us accountable except according to what is in our sphere of influence and our sphere of control. Our interests as Muslims overlap with the vast majority of human beings, and Assange and countless others like him have done a service to everyone by exposing the threats that we all face, the rotten insides of US imperialism that has destroyed human societies all over the world, even inside America, making the whole world less safe. If we are silent, we are complicit. Silence is not an option, it is self-destruction. As Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala warns us, وَمَا كَانَ رَبُّكَ لِيُهْلِكَ الْقُرَى بِظُلْمٍ وَأَهْلُهَا مُصْلِحُونَ. And your Lord would never destroy any city unjustly while their people were reformers, speaking out against injustice, trying to fix it. The glimmer of hope for our societies here in the West is that there has always been a vocal group of people standing up against the most industrialized levels of oppression our ruling classes have inflicted on humans, societies, animals, resources, and the future habitability of the planet itself. Julian Assange's victory at the end of such a long struggle should remind us that the arc of justice may be long, but it always bends in the right direction. And our duty is in the struggle, not necessarily the outcome. If you got this far into the video, you might be interested in a few other aspects of Islamic civilization that the world is in dire need of today. Click here to find out more.